Hi, I'm Paul. I'm the co-founder of an indie game development studio based in Oxford called Mode 7, and we've been going for about 15 years now. We recently became a publisher and published our first game, Tokyo 42, last year, and we've got another one on the way called The Colonists, which I hope to give you some more information on soon. The reason I'm making this video is that I've been asked to help teams with pitching their games recently via UK Games Fund's Transfuser program, and some of the conversations around that led me to think it might be good to do an introductory video on pitching games. So I've seen a lot of game pitches now, and I've also pitched in various situations, and there are some kind of common things that it's good to bear in mind. This is a thing that people worry about a lot. I think a lot of game developers are a bit unconfident about their ability to sell their game or their ability to talk about their game in public. And the first most important thing to remember really is that this process is largely about showcasing your work and your game. You're not going to magically get a deal by using a specific combination of words or being super confident or being amazing at pitching. Largely, this is about showcasing your game and showcasing the effort that you've put in there specifically. So that's my first point really, is to know what you're doing. I think if you're at the point where you're asking for money or you're asking for a publishing deal, you really should be clear on what your game is and how it's going to progress. And that means that you need to spend the time prototyping, you need to spend the time working on your own ideas, and just taking that time to understand your own processes and understand where you're going. Now, that's not an easy thing, and it's often extremely hard for first-time teams or first-time developers to get there. That's a whole topic in itself, which I might cover at some point, but you do have to go through that process first. The second thing is to know what the person you're pitching to is doing. Know who they are, the kind of games that they publish, and the kind of things that they might be looking for. That'll help you narrow down to companies or investors that might genuinely be a good fit for you, and it will also stop you getting into meetings where it becomes clear you're not really, adding value to that person, or you might be sort of wasting that person's time a little bit. So knowledge of yourself and knowledge of the person or company that you're pitching to. In terms of how to approach the pitch, the most important thing is that you get out of the way of your game. I've seen so many people come in and try to do a big presentation or try to talk up their game, or on the other end of the spectrum, just be really worried and really terrified that they're going to say the wrong thing. And all of those are emotional approaches and mindsets that are getting in the way of someone looking at your game. The person you're pitching to likely sees a lot of stuff and they have very limited time. So what they want is to get a good understanding of what's happening and not worry too much about you. Everyone involved in these processes is human beings to a certain degree, and human beings worry when they see another human being in distress, or they get upset when someone is kind of coming at them in an extremely overbearing manner. So you've just got to get yourself to the point where you're happy and calm and confident talking about your game, and you know what it is that you're doing. If you approach it that way, then you don't need to worry about how you come across too much. So the first part of your pitch needs to be introductory. And the things that I personally would want to hear in a pitch at this point would be, what kind of game is it? What makes the game unique? What makes it stand out? Why is anyone going to be excited by it or interested in it or is going to find it fun? Why are you the right person to be making it? Now, in the introductory section, this should be very, very quick. And I'm talking about things like if you're making a fighting game and you're a top-level fighting game player, or you've been involved with the community for a really long time, say, or you've helped beta test other similar games, or perhaps you made a mod that was really successful for a game in the past, or you have a track record developing this sort of thing, or even if it's your first game, but it's in a genre that you've always loved, that you have a particular deep understanding of. Just a little bit of that at the start will get me thinking, oh, this person is someone I can trust on this topic. If you're making a roguelike game and you haven't really even played roguelikes that much, or you don't seem to know kind of what's going on in that genre at the moment, then that's going to be worrying. So just presenting yourself in a very, maybe even a quick sentence at the start as the person to make the game. Also, I'd like to know what the budget is and what the time frame is. And it's useful to have that up front just because it's going to put the rest of what you're talking about into some context. Doesn't need to be an enormous budget breakdown at this stage or a month-by-month development plan. That's the kind of thing that we'll start looking at later. But just give me an idea. You know, if you're asking for £2 million to make a platformer, then that's not going to be appropriate for me, certainly, and it probably won't be appropriate for many types of investors or publishers. So just a bit of context there is good. And then when you've done that, the next thing to do is get into the game quickly. This is a difficult topic because a lot of developers are now looking for funding before they've made a prototype. And I think that is possible to do, but it's incredibly hard to achieve. The ideal thing in this situation is a vertical slice. So a small bit of the game that I could actually play, or normally you could play in front of me just to show me everything that's going on with as close to final art as you can possibly get it. Art is really hugely important, and the first impression of the game is going to make a big difference to me. If I see something that is going to look good in a GIF or in a screenshot or in a short video, as soon as you show me the game, that's going to get me really interested. It means I don't have to worry about where your art style is going to go, or whether the game's going to be polished enough to stand out, or whether it's going to have a unique style to it. So something impressive visually straight away is good. So vertical slice is the best. Functional gameplay with key art in is next best. So if you can't get everything sort of to that level of polish, if you can show me a bit of the game with some of the art in there that's indicative of the final product, and then show me some concept art of where it's going to get to, that helps me get a clear idea. And finally, grey box with concept art is the next tier. So that's quite difficult often to envisage how the game's going to play out. But if the game is, say, very systems based, or even if it's very kind of controls and skill based, showing the grey box first can be okay. So what we're looking for when people pitch us games, and this will vary from publisher to publisher, is a really strong visual style is a good place to start. So something that's going to stand out on its own and be unique. As I said, just something that's going to pop in an individual bit of marketing, an individual marketing asset is really helpful. Responsive controls that you've thought about. So even if this is something like a complex simulation game, having a UI that makes sense, or if it's an action game, having a character that feels good to move around. I have seen a lot of people pitching action games and they've got a prototype and they've handed me a controller, and then as soon as you move the character, it's very sluggish, or it's beholden to very long kind of animation cycles, or it just feels bad. And that's terrible, because that's telling me that the fundamental part of your game, the thing that the user is going to be interacting with most, is not there yet, and yet you're out asking for money. So that's something that you can do just by applying yourself and putting in the time, is make the game feel right early on, if it needs to feel right. And finally, depth. Why is someone going to play this game for several months? How is it going to stand out and attract someone, and how is it going to keep them playing for a long time? What are the stories they're going to be telling about playing this game? That's really important. We're a publisher who has very small budgets for things like marketing, so we can't bring in that huge audience for you. The game has to have innate qualities that make people talk about it, that retain people really well in order to have a chance. So that's something I'm going to be looking for in your game demo. And I think a lot of publishers are going to be after that as well. These aren't things that are necessarily peculiar to us. So do have a think about how to capture an audience and how to hold their attention, and try and show that off as you're demoing your game. Talk about the reasons people are going to stick around, the things that they might be discovering later in the game, the end game, how everything's going to work. And just give me, at that point, a clear overview of the game. You know, what are the game modes? Is it single player or multiplayer? What is the scope of the game? And scope is going to become important in the next section. So I mentioned the audience. If you have some real insights into that audience and what they like, again, to use the fighting game example, maybe you're involved with community events, or you have a good understanding of the meta game in one particular game in that genre, you will have probably more knowledge of the audience than I will as a publisher, and I want to see what that is. If there's an existing community, how are you already engaging with it? How do you plan to use them to help you test? And how do you plan to integrate that feedback into your development as you go along? Finally, I if I'm interested in the game by this point, I'll be starting to think about risk. So most investors and publishers are really looking to minimize their downside, especially companies that have a kind of portfolio approach and might sign quite a lot of games. They're going to look at things that have a realistic downside for a very, high potential upside, high potential gain. So now my brain is going to be going through, well, I like this game, maybe it's going to be too expensive, maybe the team is inexperienced and they're going to fail to complete it. The absolute worst scenario for a publisher is they put money into a game and the development team falls apart or they just can't execute it. So I need to know about the scope of the game and how you've planned that out and why that's realistic. But I also need to know, why do you want to make the game more than anything else you could be doing at the moment? How are you going to demonstrate to me your commitment that you're going to follow through and finish this thing, and that I'm not going to lose all the money and effort and energy that I'm going to put into it? Do you have experience finishing things? You might be an experienced game developer. That's great. It's going to be easier for you to pitch. But if you're a student or a new game developer, then you still need to demonstrate some experience of finishing a project, completing something on time and on budget and on scope. So there are various things that you could talk about there and that you could demonstrate, but it's definitely something that's going to be running through my mind. So that's something that you should account for. And finally, why would I want to sign this and not sign all of the other things that are being pitched to me? How is it going to stand out from that crowd of potential projects? There's so many people making games now, and there's so many people asking for funding and publishing. So you have to figure out exactly what is unique about the combination of you and the project that you're working on. So I think, just to round up, again, to reiterate what I said at the start, you don't have to be worried about pitching. Practicing doing it, practicing showing your game to people, even showing your game to new players can be really, really helpful. Some of the best teams and the best pitches that I've seen, it's clear that they've been showing their game off. Maybe they've had it at a show, or maybe they're just used to having those sorts of meetings. I think you need to be prepared for the situation. So in some instances, you might be showing your game on a screen in front of a few people, or you might be doing a small sit-down meeting. For indie games, the small sit-down meeting where you'll have a laptop there are probably the most common. So that's kind of the scenario to get comfortable with and the scenario to practice. Making sure the game works, making sure it doesn't take a long time to get into the demo, making sure your mouse works, your laptop is powered up. All of these things are important. If something technical does go wrong, it really doesn't matter if there's bugs and so on. That's something that everyone's used to, and everyone will just be trying to make the situation as clear and relaxing as possible. There are definitely resources out there in terms of how you can present a budget and how you can present a timescale. Things like Bithell Games' Game Dev Business Handbook are really useful for helping you plan out and have accurate information. People will ask you weird questions and they'll say weird stuff. They'll say, why have you not considered making the game like this? And you need to be ready for those questions, but also not defensive about them. Any feedback that you're going to get at this stage will be interesting, not least because it might reflect some weird thing your community is going to say later, or it might reflect some first impression that your game is giving off that you'll have to account for in other meetings. So that's definitely an area to think about, how you're going to cover all of these potential questions that you could be asked and hold things in your head. There is a tendency and a desire to kind of cover every base as you talk through the game, but you don't need to do that as long as you have the material ready to answer questions that might come at you. And finally, enjoy it. You've got the opportunity to go out and show people your project that you're working on and ask them questions and get a feel for what's out there. So even if you don't get a positive result, every time you do this, it's going to be informative. I've definitely learned from pitches and meetings that haven't gone as well. You can always find something to improve about you, your product, or the way you're presenting it. So seeing it as an opportunity to learn, I think, is a good way to treat it, especially if it doesn't go very well. There we go. That's all I have to say on this at the moment. If there's something else you'd like me to cover, let me know. Or if you have questions, let me know in the comments and I'll follow up at a later time. Thank you.